Okay guys, well it's Friday and normally you would receive a time-lapse Friday video, but not today. Today we're going to do something different. I just came back from Animago in Munich where I had the opportunity to do a presentation, and that presentation is called Story is King, How to Tell a Story as a 3D Artist Without Saying a Word. Now when I came back, a bunch of people asked me whether I would share my presentation, and that's what we're going to do today, right? Okay, so like I said, the topic that's very much related to the fact that I found that a lot of 3D students get stuck at a pretty early phase in their career where they're just simply not progressing. They know everything about the technical aspects of the software, they know the buttons, the tools and whatnot. However, they kind of miss the link when it comes to storytelling. And as a 3D artist, it's sometimes difficult because you don't always have the opportunity to use written or spoken words, okay? Right, so before we jump in, for those of you who do not know who I am, I'm Mike. I'm a freelance 3D artist myself. And I'm also a YouTuber, create tutorials of course. I'm a 3D consultant. I help companies to transition into 3D workflows. Let's see what else. An avid photographer, and I speak on occasion at events, as you noticed, and then I'm quite the nerd on occasion. So if you got any questions about this presentation, of course this is not live interaction, so you guys can leave a comment below and I will help you and answer your questions if I can, okay? Alrighty, so when it comes to storytelling, your ultimate goal is to trigger an emotion with your audience. Now, it doesn't really matter what emotion it is as long as you trigger an emotion. That's a starting point, right? And if you're really good at it, you can tell your story in a way that you will trigger a very specific emotion and it will occur at a very specific time, okay? And then you're talking about basically master storytellers. Now, when it comes to storytellers in general, what kind of people are we talking about? Well, what about writers, novelists, journalists, actors, singers, movie directors? All these people tell stories on a daily basis. Now, the thing is, though, that for the most part, they can use written or spoken words, and that kind of helps, right? But what if you do not have that opportunity because you, for example, are a mime? Now, this is a kind of a popular thing in Europe. Not too sure about other parts in the world, but a mime typically does not speak at all. And to my knowledge, they don't use written word either, okay? So they're still very much able to tell great stories. So that means if you can do it, if they can do it, you can do it, okay? Now, I recently came back from a fairly long trip to the US. I spent almost a month in the Arizona and Utah area. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet a very interesting gentleman by the name of Joseph. Now, excuse me, Joseph is his Christian name. I asked him about his Native American name, but he wouldn't tell me. Interesting. Anyway, Joseph is a member of the Diné Nation. Now, I didn't know what that was until they explained to me that most people know the Diné Nation as the Navajo Nation. Okay, so a Navajo Native American. Right, so I was talking to Joseph about me going to Animago and talking about this topic, and he thought it was pretty interesting because he told me that his ancestors would use graphic images to basically tell stories to each other about, where the hunting grounds were and so forth. And he actually showed me. So here are some examples of petroglyphs found in Monument Valley. And you, for example, see examples of, I guess they're deer or buffalo, bison, whatnot. And that's how they communicated. Now, I've seen things like this before, and of course, no written word there, but what surprised me a lot is the fact that he told me that even today, in 2018, the Navajo Nation still does not have a written language. So they very much depend on mouth to mouth, so, storytelling from generation to generation, what I thought was pretty awesome. Now, are there examples that we know of where there is some strong storytelling going on, however, no speech and no written language? Well, for example, how about Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner? Now, depending on your age, you know who these guys are. They have been created by Chuck Jones and Michael Maltese, and multiple generations have seen this on TV, right? Typically, no spoken word, maybe on occasion a sign or two, but that's about it. But what about modern stuff? Let's say paintings, like, well, the painting's not modern, this is the Night Watch, but for example, the icons shown here. Now, probably all of you recognize these icons, and companies spend a lot of money to make sure that you recognize them, okay? Again, no written words, no language, but you still know exactly what it's about. So how does that relate to you as a 3D artist? Well, when it comes to storytelling, for us as artists, there are a bunch of tools in our box that we can use. We can, for example, use light, composition, color, focus, motion, camera angle, focal length, age, wear, tear, and whatnot. And I'm going to go through all of these based on actual samples from the movie industry, where I'm going to talk about what techniques they used and for what purpose, right? Okay, so let's go. So we're going to start with light. Now, looking at the top left corner here, and you're going to see a lot of Pixar stuff because, you know, it's pretty cool. Top left corner, Toy Story. Jessie is telling a story, and her story is quite sad and somewhat emotional. And the light is quite subdued and soft and somewhat dreamy, so that supports that mood, okay? Top right corner, however, top lit, almost one light source, or actually a few more, but one strong light source, creating a very hard and very dark shadows, making it look kind of scary, moody, maybe a bit dangerous, or at least something you would see like in a thriller, right? And then finally, in the bottom there, Finding Nemo, the light has been used to point the viewer's eyes specifically to a certain topic, okay? So that's light. So what about composition? Now, if you know my channel, you know I'm always going on and on and on about photography, right? Now, one of the reasons is that all of the elements of composition are found in photography as well, you know, in painting and other things, but also in photography. For example, the rule of thirds, dividing your screen up into 9 boxes where you have 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines. And whenever you place your characters on an intersection or on one of these vertical or horizontal lines, it's for some reason more pleasing to the eye, and it works. It's been done for a long time. People do it all the time and it works. And you can even go against it on purpose if you want to create kind of an unsettling effect, all right? Now, the up house with the balloons. A lot of negative space going on there. Not negative in the sense of bad, but negative in the sense of space not used. A lot of blue, empty air, and that supports the story here that this house is hanging in midair, suspended by balloons. If we just had a photograph of the front porch, we wouldn't know that. If we had the front of the house with some balloons, we wouldn't know that either, right? This gives a sense of space. And then finally, in the bottom left corner, we have a scene from The Incredibles where framing has been done. Now, framing is a technique where you have an object or a shape framed around a topic to kind of emphasize that. In this case, the table, which is kind of framing the little kid there. Sometimes people use more natural elements like hedges or maybe, let's say, windows or doors. In this case, they use a table, but also the light. Okay. Now, when it comes to color, very, very, very important. Here are 3 scenes from the same movie, and here the characters all have different ages. So on the top there, you have Carl and Ellie, and they're quite young. They're young kids. The colors used are very vibrant, very almost primary. They're very youthful, I would say, playful. Okay. Now, looking at the scene in the middle where they're somewhat in their 30s probably, colors are toned down slightly, and then in the bottom scene where they are much, much older, what you see is that the color is very much desaturated, okay? Kind of emphasizing the fact that they're much older now and later in life and so forth. Now, a lot of these things are subtle. You don't really notice them until you start talking about them, but they work, okay? So what about focus? In this case, the box trolls done by Leica, what you see is that the background is blurred out, a kind of a nice bokeh effect, where the characters mid-center are very much in focus. This can again be a way to emphasize what the main topic of the shot is, right? And then, of course, if you are into animation, motion. Now, for those of you who are animators, you know all about this. For those of you who are not, you maybe do not, but there are 12 principles of animation. Now, these principles have been developed by people respectfully known as the old men, and these guys were the original animators working for Walt Disney back in the day, I think 1920s, and we're talking about people like, for example, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. Now, if you're not aware of these guys, definitely check it out. They basically laid out the foundation for what animation is today, okay? Okay, moving on. Camera angle. Now, I don't hear a lot of people talking about cameras when they're modeling and whatnot, but it's extremely important. For example, top left corner, choosing a close-up will help you to emphasize the emotion or the facial expression of a character. Looking at Woody at eye level can either be a kind of a neutral statement, so not up or down, just neutral, you know, or it can be just to point out that the viewer is equal to the character in the scene, right? Then the bottom left, low angle over shoulder, creating dominance, making Woody very big and I wouldn't say aggressive, but very present over the shoulder of Mr. Potato Head, looks like. And in the top right corner, the shot from Incredibles is the opposite. So if you want to have one character look very dominant in the scene and the other the opposite, that's a technique you can use. And then the bottom right from the Incredibles, again, a wide shot. So in this shot, you have all the characters in one scene. It's an establishing shot. It tells you who they are, where they are, and so forth. Okay. Then let's see the focal length. Well, focal length or lens used can create a couple of things here. Top one is again a wide shot. It's not extreme wide angle, but it's a wide shot where you have an establishing shot who's in the scene. And as we move downward, you see that we're getting closer and closer into Jesse's face, making it more a close-up scene. And this can support your storytelling as well. Then the next one, age, wear and tear. Now, I personally think this is exaggerated a lot by people on ArtStation and so forth, where they, for example, work with a Substance Painter. They found that you can create rust in Substance Painter, so they put rust on everything. Now, keep in mind that everything you do on your model needs to be supported by the story. It needs to fit the scene, right? So if rust or dents or scratches is something you need, then put them in, and otherwise you do not, okay? Right, so now that we know all this stuff, let's take a scene from Pixar. Here is Carl and Ellie, and they're lying in a blanket in the park. They're looking straight up, and it looks like they're looking at clouds and looking at the various shapes of clouds. And the reason why I know that is because I saw the movie, okay? All right, so let's look at the first one, light. Now, the light here is, for the most part, quite bright. There's some darker areas, some vignetting in the top left and top right corner, but the light very much helps to get your attention towards the main characters in this shot, which is Carl and Ellie, okay? From a composition point of view, we have the blanket that kind of creates a box around them, and we also have some more subtle composition elements. For example, the position of their bodies where the heads come together and they're both pointed towards one angle of the photograph. We have a triangle in between them where Ellie has her arm raised to kind of close up that triangle. And then we have another triangle from the right, you know, from her torso following her arm up, okay? So all of these quite important. Now, what about color? Not as bright as the previous scene when they were kids, you know, slightly desaturated, but very much the color supports the fact that they're in a really happy place. It's nice weather, they're outside, they're in the park, and that color supports that, okay? Okay, so what about focus? Well, everything in the scene here is in focus, so nothing is blurred. They could have done that, they didn't, but the main characters are so much centered in this shot that there was no need to do that. Okay, and then motion. Well, this is a still of a motion, but nevertheless, there is suggested motion. Ellie has raised her arm. She's pointing towards the sky. So this is kind of an extension of the frame. It takes the viewer outside of the image because there's suggestion that there's something out there, and it kind of makes you wonder, so it's a good storytelling element. Okay. So the camera, of course, if this were a very tight shot and we just saw Carl's glasses, we would have no idea what was going on. If it was an extreme wide shot where we saw the entire city with the park inside of it and them inside of that, we would have no idea what they were doing. So the way this has been captured is perfect. Okay, now this one I find quite important. Looking at the movie, and I believe it was released in 2009, where I guess Carl was maybe in his 80s or so, that would put his birthday somewhere around the 1920s. Now, looking at the props used in this shot right here, it seems that they're in their 30s, so this would be about just about 1950 or so. Looking at the camera, the prop that's there, looking at their clothing, Carl's glasses, what he's wearing, and so forth, everything supports that time frame, and it's pretty important, of course. Okay, so basically, this is all you need to do. Now, this sounds very complicated, but it's not too bad actually, and the reason why is that all of this stuff is supposed to be very intuitive. As 3D artists, we study this stuff, we look at it, we read about it and whatnot. As a viewer, however, you do not, right? You're just watching a movie and you follow along and you enjoy it, hopefully. Now, the trick here is to be really subtle about it. So don't go overboard and make things way too obvious. Viewers enjoy the fact that they are so clever that they see things that nobody else sees that makes them feel good, and they leave the theater with a smile on their face. That's kind of what we want, right? Unless you want to go with a comedy theme thing where everything is so super obvious that it's funny. Now let's do a little test here, okay? So I have 3 scenes set up, identical people, identical frame basically. The only thing different is their relative position to each other, okay? So let's open that up and let's have a look. So the scene in the middle is quite neutral, 2 people talking to each other, nothing going on really. And then on the left you have the same 2 people, same relative distance. However, she is backed up against the wall. Now immediately, because of the negative space right to the man in the scene and no space behind her at all, this creates kind of an eerie feeling. He comes off as a bit dominant, she's kind of backed into a corner, the whole sense of the scene becomes a bit more like a thriller or maybe scary, right? On the right hand side we have a scene where they're both standing basically to the wall. The distance between the 2 doesn't make sense at all, and it kind of feels off. Unless you would have, let's say, 5 or 6 other people standing next to the girl. In that case, he would be talking to a group of people, and then it would make sense. And there you see that just a simple adjustment into a scene can have a huge difference. Okay, so if we look at these 2 shots here, based on lens angle, on the left, of course, we have a very close shot of a facial expression. That's kind of the whole point of the scene. Lights support that as well, and it's to capture that emotion. While on the right you have a very wide shot of a scene to establish in time, where people are at and so forth. Okay, big difference between the 2. Now in the next shot we have a very famous one. This shot is Queen, the pop group Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody. I believe there's even a new movie out. And the light here is a single source, so there's one light source coming straight down on their forehead, creating very dark and very hard shadows. The shadows are cast in a way that most of their eyes are blacked out and under their nose as well. So you're almost looking at 4 skulls instead of people. That was exactly the whole point here, to make it look a bit eerie, okay? So that's what you can do. Now, when we look at color and the purpose of color, Again, three situations from actual movies. On the left, we have Jessie again in Toy Story. Emotional storytelling, so the color is kind of soft, almost pastel, maybe a bit dreamy, and maybe a bit romantic, if you will. The war scene in the middle, very desaturated, typically done when things are a long time ago, or they are supposed to be really grungy, really poor maybe, very remote, that kind of stuff, okay? And then on the right, if you know the story of the Matrix, you know that it's about people living in software code, not realizing that they're not real. So you want to create a color with an atmosphere that throws you off because it's not normal. You don't know why until you see the movie, but it supports that fact, okay? Right, so what else? What I see all the time is people going overboard on their model because they have fun doing that model. They forget completely about their storyline, and then it's completely off. For example, if you model a shoe store and you want to have shoes on a shelf in your store, you would have something like the shoes on the left and not on the right. I see that kind of thing all the time. Things are not worn where they should be, and vice versa. Now, I had the opportunity to get some help from a very good friend. He created a piece specially for my Animago presentation, and that friend is Henry Cervenka. Henry's an amazing 3D artist. He won my 3D modeling challenge 3 years in a row, went on to become a professional jury member, and is basically doing cool things. Okay, so thanks once again, Henry. So Henry made a scene especially for this presentation, and that's what we're going to look at. Now, in the actual presentation at Imago, I asked people to interact and comment. You guys cannot do that, of course. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to tell you guys the storyline, and hopefully you guys can follow along, right? Okay. So what do we got here? We have a female robot looking at her former self in a mirror, okay? Now, the lady in the mirror, her background is completely black because the robot vaguely remembers what she looked like, but doesn't know more detail about, the house, the interior, and so forth. In her own robot world, everything has turned into industrial, grungy, pipes, cables, and so forth, while she hardly remembers how it was back then, okay? But she still has that memory, and that is supported by the fact that this robot is somewhat rebellious. Looking just closely behind the ear of the robot, there's a tiny downward smiley, basically saying, that she is sticking it to the man. Now, if you don't know what that phrase means, you're way too young, and I would say look it up, okay? Now, as far as the chest, the whole chest area is empty, where you would normally suspect to be a heart, right? So heartless, emotionless, and so forth. It's a robot, nevertheless, still has memories. The color in that chest cavity, same thing. Not red, what you would expect, but a cold color to support the fact that the heart is absent. Then finally, the hand reaching towards the mirror. There's a tiny hole in the mirror, and through that hole you see the finger of the actual girl, right? Now that wouldn't make sense if this were a mirror. You would see nothing because there's no mirror. However, in this case, it's to support the fact that the robot not only wants to have a glimpse of the past, but actually be literally in contact with that past by touching fingers, right? So once again, very awesome piece. I think Henry spent well over 100 hours on this, so thanks you so much. Okay guys, well that brings me to the conclusion here. When you're dealing with 3D art, incorporate as many elements into it as you can. Do your research. Understand photography, look at paintings, read books, watch movies. For example, my favorite story on research is once again by Pixar, where they were doing the movie It's a Bug's World, right? Now, what they did is they took a tiny little Lego wagon on a piece of string, they put a mini camera on top of it, and they pulled it through the high grass in their front yard. The camera registered from bottom up what grass looks like if you're that tiny, and that was their inspiration for A Bug's Life, okay? So hopefully all of this helps you to become a better artist. As I mentioned, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and if I can, I will certainly help you. All right, now this presentation was obviously a bit shorter than the original. but nevertheless, you guys are not asking any questions right now. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye.